A lot of the important reactions are photochemical. That means you have to be on the surface. So that kind of eliminates deep sea hydrothermal vents. There are multiple reasons why the deep sea vents are not really relevant. It's hard to accumulate and concentrate compounds scale in that kind of environment. If you're in an oceanic environment, everything gets diluted, right? And then nothing interesting can happen.
Maybe like some simple question for those. I'm an engineer, I'm not in biology. It's just like in general, the moment of dividing the cell. So how does the cell knows that it's time to divide? Like what triggers it? Or for example, if it's also self-replicating RNA, why would it want to? It's like, all right, I want to self-replicate.
Right,
Let's do it.
So this is another big open question, right? How do you kind of keep things in sync? So we have all these ideas about how the RNA could be replicating. We have experimental results that we can take our membrane vesicles, we can feed them with more lipid molecules, they get bigger, we can see spontaneous division happen. We have different ways that can happen. So we have both sides of it, right? But now if you put everything together, how do you avoid having, say, the RNA replication keep going and going and going and then just burst the cell because it's full of too much RNA? Or how would you avoid having the membrane grow and divide and grow and divide, even though the RNA is not keeping up, right? And the RNA will get diluted out to nothing. So how to keep it synchronized is a big question. Again, we have some ideas, but that's one of the big unknowns.
But for normal cell, it's just everything is controlled by enzymes. Or?
There's incredible machinery, like alien machinery that controls it. Like absolutely impossible to imagine how it evolved from nothing. I'm kidding, but it's an extreme. Have you ever seen the micrographs of like how the genes are pulled apart and all this? I mean, there's incredible machinery that divides the cell.
And none of that machinery.
Like a cytoskeleton and
Right. So that machinery wasn't there at the beginning, right? So probably keeping these two processes working together on the same time scale was not very efficient. But that would mean that there's a very strong selective pressure to evolve machinery that would keep things from getting out of hand in one direction or the other. We think there are some simple physical processes that could have helped at the beginning, and maybe evolution would build on those processes to keep the RNA replication in sync with vesicle growth and division. But there's a lot of interesting questions there.
Yeah, I think one thing, you might have mentioned this in one of your talks, or maybe it's from somewhere else, but it's like if you have the protocell in some kind of pool of water, and there occasionally are hot bursts of hot water that will then like pull it out into a plume of hot water, and the RNA can decouple in that hot water. A little bit of how PCR works, actually, right?
Yeah,
interesting. Right. And then it can cool again later. And so maybe there are some cycles that you can get, maybe dry, wet cycles also in some kind of like physical environment. One interesting question that we haven't covered is just generally the landscape, like before you approach like the details of origins of life, what is the big picture landscape of like where did it originate? What kind of like, I'm sure you thought a lot about this, especially choosing like exactly what to focus on. What's your thinking on this? Just like the big picture questions of in what environment did it originate, kind of what chemistry was available, these kinds of things.
That's another area where the general thinking in the field has evolved a lot. So I'd say in the early days, the chemists would be doing their prebiotic chemistry synthesis in the lab and only concerned about getting the reactions to work and finding a path. But now we've gotten to the point where we can really think about, well, what kinds of environments in nature would allow the chemistry to work? And there's a kind of a feedback between the chemistry and the geology. The chemists say, like, I want this reaction to work. Here's the conditions that I've got it to work in. Talk to the geologists. Is there an environment where this could happen? And they might say, yeah, it could happen in a volcanic region, or maybe in an alkaline carbonate lake, or someplace where you have wet-dry cycles. Or maybe they'll say, well, that's just not realistic. You have to go back to the drawing board and find some chemistry that can work in environments that we know would have been around. So this kind of feedback, I think, is very, very helpful. And it lets us focus on environments like impact crater environments or volcanic regions. So I'll just give one simple example. So we were talking before about cyanide being a great starting material for the chemistry, right? But cyanide's formed in the atmosphere and rains out as a very dilute solution, which will then just go and hydrolyze and not give you anything interesting. So how do you capture the cyanide and build up a reservoir? Chemically, that's very simple. If you have iron around, you can form iron cyanide complexes like ferrocyanide, and those could potentially accumulate and build up a reservoir. So that was a great theory, but what kind of actual natural environment could that take place in? So that led David Catling in Seattle to do some really interesting modeling of these alkaline carbonate lakes, which is a natural environment they've been studying. And they found that indeed, under these conditions, which can happen in nature, ferrocyanide molecules could accumulate and could be something that builds up a reservoir. It's a great example of this kind of feedback between chemistry and people who study the geology and the geochemistry of natural environments.
So then what kind of environment is needed? Is like volcanoes, something carbon, nitrogen atmosphere, high pressures, gradients in temperature, UV. What is this list of? Let's say if you would like to have build a, I don't know, some sort of greenhouse like in the lab, what do we need to do?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's pretty clear from the chemistry is a lot of the important reactions are photochemical. So you need UV light from the sun. So that means you have to be on the surface. So that kind of eliminates deep sea hydrothermal vents.
So that would be a big thing, right? So hydrothermal vents were this kind of origin of life story for a while. Your feeling is that because of the UV requirement, it can't happen.
There are multiple reasons why the deep sea vents are not really relevant. It's hard to accumulate and concentrate compounds at scale in that kind of environment. Mm-hmm. If you're in an oceanic environment, everything gets diluted, right? And then nothing interesting can happen. People have studied the chemistry of those environments, and in my opinion, basically no interest in chemistry that gets you close to the building blocks of biology has been found. We were talking before about the crystallization of RAO. That can only happen on a surface environment where things are getting concentrated, you have evaporation, you have solid surfaces. Yeah, lots of reasons for liking surface environments. We need UV light. We were also talking before about sulfur chemistry. Where does sulfur come from? Volcanic outgassing gives you sulfur dioxide, which turns out to be really important for a lot of the chemistry, but also hydrogen sulfide. So if you've ever been to any place near a modern volcano or even like Yellowstone, you can smell hydrogen sulfide, right, from miles away.
It's like mineral water, right? It contains a lot of it.
Some of them contain a lot, right. So by studying natural environments, we can focus in on what gives you the right starting materials, what gives you the right physical processes so things can get concentrated, and what gives you a kind of the fluctuations in the environment that might be required. As you said, wet-dry cycles, light-dark cycles, temperature cycles, all kinds of things like that.
One of the things that I think probably the craziest environment idea that I read was ocean spray. So having droplets of ocean spray where the air is the outside of the membrane and the inside is just water. I don't know, what's your take on the ocean spray?
Yeah, again, there's interesting chemistry that can happen on those interfaces, which is definitely something that should be studied more. But I find it hard to imagine how you could have growth and division or how you could feed nutrients into So I think the idea of membrane-bound protocells in a liquid environment makes what's easier to think about for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's no mechanism for gaining anything from the environment.
I think these aerosols that are generated from waves and spray could be really important for dispersing early life around the planet. That's one possibility.
Is it also possible maybe to do some live space travel, send it to other planets, use maybe light sail?
Oh.
I don't know. How is it? I see the biggest problem is probably the gamma rays, but maybe there is something else. Or could it be that someone send a similar light sail to Earth?
I mean, Avi Loeb claims this is what happened.
So So I think when the solar system was young, especially when it was very young, there were a lot of large impacts, not just the Earth, but Mars and other planets, right? So there's a lot of transfer of material, rocks, that got ejected after a large impact and eventually land on another planet. But I think the transfer of life between planets within our solar systems is possible. Maybe we'll find life in on subsurface Mars or in Enceladus. If we do, I bet it will be related to our life. It's a totally different ballgame when you're talking about transfer between planets and different stars.
Just because of it falls off with R squared, basically. The signal should be very small.
It should be a small signal, the radiation damage during millions of years in space. On the other hand, just in the last few years, astronomers have detected things from other
Asteroids
that actually came presumably from other solar systems, right? That have come whizzing through our solar system and then just gone off again into space. So yeah, probably some fraction of those hit the early Earth, but what's the chance that they actually carried anything alive in the first place and then anything survived the impact and survived the journey? I'm personally pretty skeptical that could actually happen, but who knows?